First of all, just to remind everybody that our second exam will be April 5th. April 5th. That's the first day after the spring break. Okay, make sure that you are prepared, because so we will meet again on Wednesday and talk about Kant, and that's all the material you will need. If you follow that review sheet, you see we're almost at the end of it. Today we'll cover Hume, so then there is 5 more questions left for Kant, and that's the end of the review. For those of you guys who are not keeping it up with the review, or want to go over it again, you have plenty of time during the spring break. You can do it before the spring break if you don't want to spend time on the spring break, but you will need to do it by April 5th, because just like with the previous exam, on midnight between 4th and 5th, which is Sunday to Monday, exam will become available, and you'll have 24 hours again to complete it. And once again, there will be additional 24 hours with 10% penalty after that, and again that will be a big part of your grade. So now you already know what to expect. Make sure you are prepared. I will again send a link to all these videos, but hopefully you know where to find them already. They're all there on YouTube. If you are unsure about any questions, go back there, watch it again, make sure you understand what the correct answers are. And once again, the way we do it now is at the beginning we only cover a couple of questions. All the rest of them are in the previous video, and I do mark them rather clearly now so that you could see on a slide what the question should, what answer the question should have. Okay, with that in mind, let's talk about David Hume. Last empiricist we will cover. In fact, when we talk about Kant on Wednesday, Kant is what more or less puts an end to this distinction between rationalists and empiricists, because he actually kind of puts it all together in one package. Now, before we get to Hume, few things we do need to refresh our memory on, and hopefully you can understand it better if you missed it before. So one of the important topics we've been talking about for a while now is substances. So let's just clear up this hopefully once and for all. Did Locke think there are no substances? Like substances don't exist? Did he ever hold this view? And remember, last time we talked about Berkeley. Locke was a week before. What was his position about substances? I believe this is one of the questions on the review too. So what is the importance about substance? Substance is essentially that stuff which everything is made of, right? When we talk about different objects, is there something there or not? Is there such thing as a pen? Or is it just a phantom of my imagination? So that's why it is important. But with Locke, it is sometimes a little difficult to understand his position. So I want to try to clear it up. Did he think there are no substances? Yes, he thought there are no substances. So he is an idealist. And again, we're not talking about Berkeley. Berkeley, who we discussed last time, is an idealist. Remember, Locke is not an idealist. So the answer is no. He thought there were substances. But he said he didn't know what it was. So that's Locke's position. He said there's definitely something there. I mean, there's something. I can feel it, for God's sake. There's something. But I don't know what it is. Now, remember, Locke said that we only have access to our ideas, but our ideas represent reality very well. And so, despite the fact that we don't have access to it directly, we can kind of assume it's there. And remember, this is where Berkeley comes in after Locke and says, wait a minute here. If we don't have any access to them, how come we even saying they're there? Based on what? We have only access to our ideas. Doesn't it make then sense to say the only thing there are our ideas? So did Berkeley think there are no substances? Okay, well, it is partially correct. Because remember, there are actually two types of substances. So while he was saying it is true there are no material substances, but there are spiritual substances. So while for Locke there actually are both, for Berkeley there are only spiritual substances. What are the spiritual substances? An example of a spiritual substance. God, exactly, that's one. And also each and every one of us. We are spiritual substances too. God is not the only thing in existence. There's God and there's us. Everything else is the ideas which God directly gives us. So to Berkeley it made perfect sense, and remember, he was trying to support it with all sorts of other stuff. So again, while Locke thought there were both material and mental substances, spiritual substances, for Berkeley there is only spiritual substances. Now what did Berkeley call his philosophical position? Following from all that, it kind of makes sense. It's tempting to say he is an idealist, but he did not call himself an idealist. What did he call himself? Come on guys, that should be easy. Exactly, good job, William. I'll give you extra credit for that. Immaterialist, that's exactly what he called himself. Immaterialist. He was saying there's no matter. That's the only thing he was fairly certain about. But it doesn't make any sense for there to be matter. He was saying there's all sorts of problems associated with our belief in matter which has no foundation. What are we basing it on? What is matter? We don't even know. Look, Locke has been trying to figure it out. He didn't know. Who knows? What the hell is matter? Then why are we making it up? The only thing in existence is the ideas and the spirits, which is God and us. Okay, now according to Berkeley, what causes our ideas? Now that should be easy too, right? Experiences cause our ideas? Now that would not be Berkeley for sure. It's kind of experiences, but where is it coming from? Does it come from objects? I mean, on one hand you can say, yeah, it is a type of experience, but experience itself is not causing the idea, it is the result. No, our own minds, so we make up the reality. Remember we talked about it last time. If our own minds cause the reality, how come I can't make it $1 million on my table? I should be able to. What's the problem? Why can't my mind make it up? Why there's nothing on my table, even though I really want the $1 million? God! Come on guys, God! God causes our ideas. God gives it directly to us. That's what causes our ideas. And that's why we can't make up this $1 million on my table. Because unless God decides that I should have $1 million, that's not going to happen. And God makes sure that it only follows the strict laws, which we call scientific laws. So for this reason, in order for there to be $1 million, a whole chain of events should take place. As a result of this chain of events, there may eventually be $1 million. And even though this is all just an ideas, but these ideas are not generated by us. They are generated by God, and therefore we have no control over them. We cannot just twist them any way we want. We can twist our own ideas any way we want, but not the ideas we get from, you may say, from external source, which is God. Okay, hopefully by now we have gotten it down. This is important. It is kind of disturbing to me that you are not able to answer these questions. Anyway, let's get to Hume now. Hume is the next generation, born 1711, again quite a bit younger than Berkeley, in Edinburgh, Scotland. Rather modest Calvinist family, although he was type of I think, nobility, but rather low level, not a wealthy person by any means. Attended Edinburgh University in his 20s, went to France and written a treatise of human nature. I hope you guys read the chapter in a book, which is assigned, but I know not many people actually do that, because it spends quite a long time talking about Hume. There's a lot of interesting stuff from his biography, which we have no time to go over. Kind of an interesting person. Now, his first work, again, a treatise of human nature, did not receive much attention. In fact, he said it was stillborn. Nobody cared. It is now considered one of the great works of philosophy, but back then they were not paying much attention to it. To follow up on that, he created a couple of other works, the Inquiries, one of them, Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, well-known work too, kind of try to clarify the ideas of the treatise, put them in a shorter form. He was struggling to get a position at the Edinburgh University during his lifetime, because as a result of his work he was considered an atheist. He was not an atheist, as we will see today, but people thought he was, since he, his work was generally very skeptical, and he addressed the question of the existence of God and so on. So they repeatedly rejected his applications for a chair of philosophy there, which is kind of ironic, given that today the entire department of philosophy at Edinburgh University has his name. But that's how it often happens during their lifetime. People are not appreciated and not given their fair due, but when they die, after sometimes a couple of centuries, everybody's like, oh, he was such a genius. Well, that's the case with Hume. Nonetheless, he had a rather comfortable life. He eventually got a pension from, I believe, government or something, and basically did okay. His most popular work during his lifetime was actually not in philosophy, but in history, and he received some good praise for it. But today, nobody pretty much reads his history books, history of England books, but everybody knows his philosophical work. Okay, enough about Hume himself. What was his philosophy? Now, remember, again, Locke and Berkeley lived, well, actually, Berkeley was still alive when he already attended the Edinburgh University. On the other hand, Locke was already dead, but he died shortly before Hume was born, so their work was everywhere. You could read it. It's all in English, so it made it so much easier. All three of them wrote in English, and therefore Hume was familiar with both Locke and Berkeley, which kind of explains some of his ideas pretty well. He read them and he reacted to what they were saying too. At the beginning of the treatise, which again is his first philosophical work, written in his 20s, he takes up this large task. He thinks, well, there's so much talk about philosophy, so much speculation, but in order for us to understand philosophy, to be able to answer this difficult question, we have to understand human nature. Human nature itself will give us many answers. So he suggests to go directly to the source of all these controversies, all these different opinions philosophers have, to human nature itself, and to look at the human nature, what kind of creatures we are, what's going on in our head. And then he follows first on Locke. Remember Locke's distinction of ideas. Where do ideas come from? What are the ideas? That stuff which is in our mind. He actually somewhat disagrees, because for Locke, everything in our head was an idea. Now this is an important distinction Hume is making. He's saying, no, actually, there is perceptions in our mind. What Locke called ideas, he calls perceptions, but they are of two different kinds. And this is an important distinction. Some of them are impressions, and the others are ideas. And they are distinct. And this is the difference. original experiences we have, our impressions. So, for example, when I look at the monitor, I have an impression. There's a very vivid picture in my mind of this monitor which I'm looking at right now, right? Similarly, if I look at this pen. Now, if I try to remember it a couple of hours later or tomorrow or whatever, that will be an idea. So the idea is kind of what our mind generates based on the impressions. And there is an important difference. So being an empiricist, he of course gives priority to those impressions. He says they are more lively perceptions, and they happen when we hear, see, feel, love, hate, desire, or will. So note that it doesn't have to be sensual in a sense that you don't have to necessarily see an object. But if you feel something, if you feel hate, if you see, I don't know, somebody you hate, and you feel this hatred inside of you, that would be an impression too. What would be an idea? Well, if tomorrow I come down, I'm no longer angry at this person, I'm perhaps still kind of hate them, but not as much as when I saw them, and then I'll remember my yesterday's feeling about this person, that would be an idea. So note again that it will not be as vivid and powerful. It will be kind of somewhat less important. So again, the ideas would be these less forceful copies of faint images of our impression, and as all empiricists, he basically says all ideas are parasitic on impressions. This is where they come from. At some point in your life, you had an impression of whatever it is. And based on that, you have some sort of an idea. That's the only way it works. It does not stay in your mind when you're born as some sort of pre-installed software. Nothing is. Now, note though that we of course have ideas which are, again, kind of complex, abstract, and so on. So where do they come from? For example, the idea of God, right? You can say, I've never had impression of God, I've never met God. Well, you have number of impressions, right? For example, most people think of God as a person. Why? Well, we had impression of people. So it's easier for us to think of God as just another person, some sort of grandpa, right? This nice grandpa. Imagining God as something else is pretty much impossible. I guess we can imagine God as triangle or something, but that wouldn't make much sense to us. And the only other way to think of God is some sort of nothing, right? Some sort of well, if you say, well, he's not like human beings, well, then what is he like? Well, I don't know, just something. So in other words, some form of stuff which I've never experienced in my life. And then it kind of becomes nothing, doesn't it? Because you can't imagine it. Unless you saw it before, you can't imagine it. Where would it come from? Nowhere. Every single idea we have comes from some sort of impression, and then if you don't have any impression to attach it to, if all you do is just give it a name, such as God, then you have nothing to see in your mind when you think about it. Unless, again, you will think of it as some sort of grandpa. Okay, so even though there's typically one-to-one correspondence between impressions and ideas, creative power of our mind does work on them and compound, transpose, and augment them. So you can take several simple ideas, put them together, and create a new idea. That's how we create ideas of not just God, but unicorns, dragons, all this stuff. Where do they come from? Clearly, if you're thinking of, let's say, unicorn, you are taking an idea of a horse, taking an idea of a horn, putting them together, there you go. Your mind kind of shuffles around this stuff which you have had an impression of before and puts it in some sort of a new way. Try to imagine something which you have never seen before. You will not be able to do that. That's not going to happen. So he definitely is, again, empiricist in that sense. All of them have this in common. Remember, they do not believe that there's any idea in our mind pre-installed, be it idea of God, be it idea of anything else. Now, he also follows this kind of empiricist approach when he tries to be just like Newton. He's trying to figure out what are the laws. What are the laws governing these ideas? Remember, for Locke thought about it in a very, very primitive type of way, you may say, kind of a box. Our mind is an empty box. The ideas are particles, atoms of some sort, and then they get into our mind one by one, and then our mind works on them. Now, it is a little bit similar in Hume, but not that simple. He says that there are different principles by which we actually associate those ideas. One of them is principle of resemblance. Ideas which are similar tend to be associated together. So, for example, if you see a picture of a horse, you may immediately think of a horse you've seen somewhere else at some other point. Contiguity, ideas which appear together in space or time, are again associated. Interesting example, let's say you're thinking about Vatican, right? You see on TV a program about Vatican, but it doesn't talk about the Pope, but your mind can bring Pope right away because you know Vatican and Pope are associated ideas. So even though Vatican doesn't resemble the Pope, they are a very different type of thing, but your mind kind of associates them because you know Pope lives in Vatican. So naturally that makes sense to put them together. And the third principle, very important principle, which he actually spent quite a lot of time discussing, is cause and effect. Cause and effect. Every time we see events succeeding each other, we associate them together. Like a wound and pain. If you're wounded, you will feel pain. So if somebody is trying to stick a needle into you, you will avoid it. Why? Well, you have experienced it before. You know it is painful. Imagine if you never have experienced it, you probably wouldn't be that worried about it at first. You could think, oh, okay, let's see what happens. And then they stick a needle in you and it's painful, and then you would say, okay, I don't like that. But since we all been there, we already know that since very early age. And again, note, we know it from experience. But knowing it from experience, we now know better. As a child, you may have touched fire or something, you got burned, and you don't want to do it again. Similarly with needles, similarly with all sorts of other stuff. So cause and effect is extremely important for us as human beings in order to operate normally. We do kind of expect things to cause other things. And this is how we essentially build our life, right? We think that if we do something, there will be consequences. And if something is done to us, it will have a consequence. So that is a natural thing, but Hume will actually look deeper into it and try to find out what's going on there behind this curtain. Another important distinction he makes, and this is actually kind of a connection to Philosophy 102. If you took Philosophy 102, or if you will take it, you may talk more about it, is the distinction between two kinds of reasoning. Relation of ideas and matters of fact. So again, remember, the ideas in our head, according to Hume, is those copies of impressions we have. Mathematics, arithmetic would be a very good example of that. Where do you get an idea of number 2? You probably saw 2 objects of some kind, right? Say 2 chairs, 2 candies, 2 bottles of wine. Now, again, from experience, you know that if you have another 2 candies or bottles of wine or whatever, you will have a total of 4. And that is relation of ideas. You take in these 2 ideas, you put in them together, and you get in from that another idea. Now, the reasoning based on this type of relations is called deductive reasoning. Again, in Philosophy 102, we go much deeper into that. Those of you who took it with me before probably are familiar with this. So deductive reasoning is, of course, necessary reasoning. Necessary truths come out of it, just like 2 + 2 = 4. Note that it is necessary. There's absolutely no way. Is there any way 2 plus 2 will not equal 4? Can it happen? No. There's just no way. It's like true by definition, and as long as you have any kind of brain and able to understand what it means, you will agree. It will always be equal 4. So this is a necessary truth. Now how about the other kind of reasoning? Matters of fact, related to matters of fact. Now this reasoning is known as inductive reasoning, and it concerns experience. Stuff which we observe around ourselves every day. Matters of daily life, all of them, again, as you will probably learn in Philosophy 102, are matters of probability and not necessity. Even the most seemingly clear ones. We give a lot of examples in Philosophy 102. Science basically just, most of it is, with exception of stuff like mathematics again, which is based on deductive reasoning, most of the science, experimental science, based on matters of fact, on inductive reasoning. What does it mean? It means if you want to know what causes a certain thing or what is going on with certain stuff, you conduct an experiment, right? You observe certain actions, like relating to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 objects. For example, if you want to know the law of gravity, you may be dropping them one after another from the building and learning that they are falling down. You may be measuring their speed and so on, and so you will reach a law of gravity. You will figure out that it seems to be that when you drop objects from the building, they always fall down and with certain speed, which depends on their mass. Now here's the question now. Is there similar certainty as with 2 plus 2 equal 4? And it's an interesting question, and example of gravity is actually a pretty good example here. Some of the other examples are more obviously not as certain, but let's take gravity. Every time you drop something, let me drop this pen right now. I know it will fall, right? Oh, there you go, it fell. How do you know it will fall next time? How certain are you? Are you as certain about it as 2 plus 2 equal 4? Yes, why? Now imagine if it does not fall. Can you imagine that? Yes, previous experience, exactly. But suppose it doesn't fall. Suppose you let it go and it floats upwards. Now, you would be amazed. There's no doubt about that. But would it be like 2 plus 2 equal 5? You think so? Really? No, there's a difference. Like, suppose you were taken into outer space or something while you were sleeping, and you woke up on, I don't know, spacecraft. You didn't even know. You wake up, you drop the pen, it doesn't fall. It actually floats. So not only it's possible, it's actually certainly will happen. We know that. We already been to outer space. During the time of Hume, it wasn't a possibility, but today it is. In fact, soon enough, they say tourists may go there. So it actually is not only likely, but it is absolutely certainly can happen. How about 2 plus 2 equal 5? Can you imagine sometime in the future they'll be able to figure out a way to make 2 plus 2 equal 5? No. Even when you're on Earth, suppose tomorrow something happens and gravity switches off. Now, obviously, we will be amazed. We will say, what is going on? Like, this is insane. Nonetheless, it does not contradict reason. It just amazes us, but it does not contradict reason. On the other hand, to imagine that 2 plus 2 equal 5 Well, it basically just means there's something happened with your brain, right? Because 2 plus 2 will never equal 5. That cannot happen. On the other hand, with gravity, all we have is experience. And so based on experience, naturally we expect that to happen, but it does not have to happen. We don't even understand why it happens, because we don't know what gravity is. We know it's natural phenomenon, but we don't know why. Why is this phenomenon exists? So that's the important difference. And with many other things, it's even more obvious when you, in science, try to figure out what is happening, why is it happening. You may think that this is caused by a certain thing. You may expect it to be happening, but then once you observe it longer, whatever, you discover that that actually is not the case. You may have gotten something wrong, and this is not what is causing it. In fact, every time you're talking about matters of fact and using inductive reasoning, which is basically generalizing from number of particular instances to the whole to making some sort of general law, such as the law of gravity, that is a matter of probability, and we can only say, well, I'm 99.99999% sure. But you can never say I'm 100% sure, not like with relation of ideas, 2 plus 2 equals 4. And that's an important difference between deductive and inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is based on probability and not certainty. Okay, now one of his most interesting observations based on all that stuff, based on his trying to apply reasoning to the phenomenon, is the idea of the self. Remember Descartes, and he also read Descartes. Descartes was saying that he discovered the self, that thinking thing. Now Hume asks us, wait a minute, do we ever actually experience the self? What exactly is the self? He agreed with Berkeley, saying that the idea of material substance, which Locke came up with, doesn't make much sense, and we cannot say that material substance exists. But how about this spiritual substance, which Berkeley himself talks about? Berkeley was justifying it by the fact, well, I exist, right? And I know other people exist. But Hume is saying, do you really? Let's think about it. Think about yourself, what you are. Now, Hume is saying the only thing you will notice is the succession of ideas, succession of feelings, successions of perception. So at one point, like right now, you may say, I feel slight pain in my left knee, I feel warm, I feel sunshine, I feel like I'm talking, I feel this and that. This is all feelings. Where are you? What is you? Do you feel you? What is there behind all that stuff? And he's saying that nothing. We really can't point at anything. He's saying a person is nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other with inconceivable rapidity and are in perpetual flux and movement. That's what person is. And in fact, when we don't have that, when you have absolutely no perception, you can't even talk about yourself as existing. So he's saying the mind, the spirit, which Berkeley was talking about, is a kind of a theater where several perceptions successively make their appearance, pass, repass, glide away, mingle in an infinite variety of postures and situations. There is properly no simplicity in it at any time, nor identity at different time. Whatever natural propension we may have to imagine that kind of simplicity and identity. Now let's discuss this. What do you guys think? Do you agree or disagree with Hume? Do you think there is a concept of self other than that? And by that, again, he means just as stream of consciousness, you may say. Stream of constant feelings, impressions, perceptions. Now it's again like with Greek philosophy when we were talking about me when I was 15 years old. Am I the same person? Are you the same person you were 10 years ago? What does that even mean? Well, can you actually feel your heartbeat? If you can feel it, then of course it is a perception. Most of us usually are not aware of our heartbeat, unless you like actually put your hand on your chest, or unless you are so excited that it's really like pounding, right? Let's face it, most of the time, if you are right now watching the computer, are you actually feeling your heartbeat? Can you literally feel it? I'm pretty sure it's there, but whether you can perceive it, the perception, remember the perception has to come through the senses, right? You have to actually be aware of that. Knowing that it should be there. Now that's another question which he actually picks up from Berkeley, right? For example, if I leave the room, how do I know the table and the furniture is still there? Berkeley would tell you it's not. It actually is not there. The only sense in which it is there is if you come back, you will experience it again. But in no other way it is there. So the book mentions this famous example of if the tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, does it make a sound? And Berkeley is saying, no, it doesn't make a sound. Because the sound is what you perceive. So similarly here, Hume would tell you, well, is there such thing as yourself 2 years ago? Or is it a completely different person? Now, what exactly is this continuity? I mean, okay, maybe there's some similarity you see in the mirror. You see your own face and you saw it 10 years ago and it's kind of similar. Not the same note, but similar. Fair enough. But is that enough to say it's the same person? What makes you the same person? Note that from biology we know that actually what we are made of, this stuff, all the molecules, they are replacing, constantly being replaced. And in fact, in over 7 years, your body completely replaces all the molecules. It just rebuilds them. DNA kind of keeps it the same, but the material which comes from your food, whatever you consume, has been supplied to replace it, which is also why we are able to heal our wounds and so on. But how is it the same person then? And on top of that, as human being, you may have completely different ideas about reality. You may think of yourself differently, of other people differently. If enough time has passed, and I'm old enough to remember myself, say, 30 years ago, that's a lot of time. The way I was 30 years ago, I kind of remember myself, but I'm really wondering sometimes whether I can still say I'm the same person, because it's such a different person. It's almost like watching a movie about somebody else. There's all these memories, but like I totally understand them in a different way now. The same experiences mean different things to me. So, is there even such thing as you? Well, in other words, what Hume is suggesting is not only there's no material substances, there's no mental substances either. There's simply no substances. It's just like remember the Heraclitus, that you cannot step into the same river twice? That's exactly the idea. The river is always different. We may still call it the same thing, we still call ourselves the same name, but you're different, I'm different, everything changes all the time. And we only make up these substances, and we also make up ourselves. There's no self, we just have this flow of emotions, and that's all there is to it. Okay, another important contribution he has is when he started questioning this idea of causality. We already did it a little bit, remember, with gravity. If you let the pen drop, it will fall. So cause and effect. I'm letting it go, it's dropping. Now, everything we do in life, we kind of assume follows these laws of causality. And he's saying, well, fair enough. But what are these laws? What is going on? Every time we say there's a cause and effect, What is happening there? He says that the foundation of these causal judgments we have are based on the following things. The three things you can name very easily. Contiguity of events in space, so cause must somehow contact the effect, right? When I'm letting go of the pen, my fingers actually touching the pen, and then they are no longer touching it. Priority in time, so first I let it go, then it falls, not the other way around. Constant conjunction of the two events, that's exactly what we talked about before. The law of gravity, constant conjunction. Every single time I let go of my pen, it falls. Every single time I let go of something else, it will fall too. Now here's the fourth one. The fourth one is what we assume, but what we never, he says, experience. And this is necessary connection. What makes it necessary that every time I let go of the pen, it will fall? We assume that based on experience, because every time I did let it go, it did actually fall. But he's saying, is that good enough? And his answer is no. No, it's not. He's saying that necessary connection is actually something we add, something our mind contributes. So if every time something happens, we tend to think of it as A causing B. So every time we observe A, right, event A, whatever it may be, and every time it is followed by B, so then we say, okay, that means A causes B. It's rather natural thing to do for a human being. This is how we survive, right? It's the instinct of survival. Every time you see a bear will eat you. It ate your next door neighbor, it maybe ate somebody else, so don't go near a bear. This is how humans operated from the beginning. Suppose there is a weird fruit growing in the forest. You ate it, you had horrible pain. Next time your friend ate it, he also had horrible pain in the stomach. What's the natural conclusion? Don't eat it, right? It causes pain. Now, again, that while it is true in most cases, what he's saying it is not true in all the cases. And the reason is that causality which we have as an idea is an invention of our mind. Whether or not one thing really causes another, we cannot possibly know. So the whole principle of induction, so-called principle of induction on which science is built, is built on this law of causality. We expect things to be following each other. And again, we talk about it more specifically in Philosophy 102. We expect them to follow these laws of nature, be it gravity, be it whatever other stuff. So that's why we do experiments, right? We observe that something happens every single time, and then we say, okay, so that means there's a law of nature, and it will be happening forever, every single time, everywhere. But more or less, every single time it is based on probabilities. One good example which I bring in Philosophy 102 is from the famous example of black swans, right? Suppose you want to know whether there are any black swans in existence. So you go and you look at swans, right? That is a scientific thing to do. You study swans. You have encountered 100 swans, all of them white. Do you have reason enough to say there's no black swans? Well, yeah, like basically what you actually have is a probability. You're saying, what is the chance that I looked at so many swans and I haven't seen a single black one, but yet there is a black one? There's a chance, obviously. It's possible that you just got unlucky, but black swan is very rare and you haven't seen it. Nonetheless, at some point you really have to stop, right? You cannot be counting swans forever. That's pointless stuff to do. So you just stop and you say, okay, how about I say, in all probability, it seems likely that there's no black swans. And based on this reasoning, I conclude that there are no black swans. Because that actually works for me. If there's ever turn out to be black swan, I will revise this theory, which is why science works like this, right? They revise their theory. But right now, based on the evidence I have, I can conclude there are no black swans. So this is more or less how we go through life. We never have this complete certainty like 2 plus 2 equals 4. We have the probabilities. Do I have a complete certainty that next time I drive my car, I'm not going to get into a horrible accident? Of course not. In fact, I know there's a chance I might. Why do I drive anywhere then? Why don't I sit at home all day? Well, because the probability is very low, right? We know it happens, but it happens like very rarely. Most times, even if you do get into an accident, it's not that bad. And so based on that, when you measure one risk against the other and you say, okay, on one hand, to avoid this risk, I will be sitting at home all time. On the other hand, I take this little risk and I am aware of the fact that there's a little risk, but I will be doing this fun stuff with my life. I actually would like to take the second option because, let's face it, we will all die one day. So you can't avoid it even if you sit at home, but I still want to have, fulfilling life. I want to take this risk. I am aware of it and I want to take it. So similarly, with science, they, for example, test these vaccines, right? Do they have 100% probability that they will work and there's no consequences? Not really. I mean, nobody can tell you for sure, but they have rather good evidence that it is safe, and they have rather good evidence that it works against COVID. So based on that, they are telling you to take it, and some people are saying, well, but what if I die? Well, just like with the car accident, there is a teeny tiny chance that you might die, but the benefit of actually getting the vaccine is so much greater than the risk of dying from the vaccine that it simply makes sense for you to do that. Because the science, the evidence tells you that it's a lot more likely that you will benefit than that you will be hurt. Again, that's just common sense. And this is what we call principle of induction. Every single time we apply this kind of knowledge of facts, put it together, and decide for ourselves based on probability. Does it make sense to take this course of action or not? And we never have the kind of certainty like 2 plus 2 equals 4, because it just doesn't work in life. Nothing is that certain. Nobody will give you 100% guarantee that the vaccine will be safe and will not hurt you. That's just impossible. But you have a good probability, and that is what you have to take. Now, note that Hume is not denying causality in a sense that he is not saying there's no such thing as one thing causing the other. He's saying, I have never asserted so absurd a proposition as that anything might arise without a cause, which is what some people accused him of. He's saying, I only maintain that our certainty of the falsehood of that proposition proceeded neither from intuition nor from demonstration, but from another source. So what is this source? Why are we, for example, always sure that every time I will let go of the pen, it will fall down? What's the source of this certainty? What do you think? Magic of some sort? Why are you sure that every time you will let go of an object, it will fall down? And there is a simple answer. Well, yeah, past experience, he says habit, matter of habit. Habitually, that's what happened, a custom or a habit. Every single time in the past, which I let go of any object, be it pen, ball, whatever else, it drops, it goes down. And based on that, I conclude that this is how it works. Not just with gravity, but with other things too. I just observe them, and I see that it is happening, and so I assume that this is how things work. Every time you, for example, touch electricity, you get shock. Do you have to get a shock? I don't know. I mean, you may say not necessarily, but it seems like that's what is happening. So I assume this is what causes the shock, the electricity. Okay, now he also talks about ethics, talks about morality, and he tries to take this kind of critical approach to morality too. So one thing he tries to undermine there, or at least questions, is the role of reason. He's saying, what role does our reason play in ethics, in morality? And his answer is actually very, very minor. He's saying we're not driven by reason. What exactly are we driven by? He says passions and feelings. So the entire morality, the moral philosophy, seem to be resting on our emotions. That's what we say when we say something is good, and that's what we say when we say something is evil. That will be quite influential in the future development of British and modern philosophy. So the idea is this: when we make a moral judgment, when we say this is good, what we actually are saying is that I find it pleasing. I find that this is a nice thing, that it makes me feel good. And when we say that we apply reason, he's saying reason is only serving your passions. Reason there kind of after your passions. He gives an example of anything, say a murder scene. Suppose there's a murder and you investigate this murder. The book gives quite a good breakdown of that too. So let's say you are trying to approach it with reason. Now remember, there's possibility of matters of fact and relation of ideas. This is two ways your reason works. So relation of ideas, deductive reasoning, 2 + 2 = 4. This is going to help you to figure out whether murder is moral. Now it may be a little bit difficult to answer it right away unless you start thinking about it and hopefully again read the chapter in the book, because the chapter kind of gives a better feel for it than I can give you in these few minutes. Nonetheless, the idea is this: that if you just look at the murder scene by seeing what is going on, your ideas, relation of your ideas, will never actually tell you anything about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. This deductive reasoning will not help you in any way. You can't use mathematics to figure out whether it's wrong to kill somebody. Now, if you go with matters of fact, again, you investigate the murder from the point of view of what is going on here. There's a knife on the floor, there's blood, there's this and that, kind of Sherlock Holmes type of approach. Now, is that going to help you to figure out whether it's moral? And his answer is again, of course not, because the facts themselves don't tell you anything about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. The facts just tell you, well, it is a fact that there's a knife, say, 15 inches from the body. It is a fact that the body is in a particular position, and so on. That's pretty much all it will tell you. So now, what exactly do you base your conclusion that murder is wrong? Value judgment. So this is in 102, we talk about the distinction between matters of fact and value judgments. What is the value judgment? The value judgment is to say that something is good, bad, better, worse, more important, less important than some other thing. Every time you're making a value judgment, you're basing it on what? On your personal values, which more often than not is the result of your culture, your religion, your association with other people, what did your parents teach you, and so on. That is not a matter of fact, so it cannot be a fact that murder is wrong. The fact that murder is wrong, or that, I don't know, any other act is either wrong or right, that something is either good or bad, can only be gained from our feelings, from the way we feel about it. We don't want to be murdered, we don't like our loved ones to be murdered, so that's why we say it is wrong. It is not a fact, it's our feeling about the subject. So he's saying you cannot even use reason here. The reason is not going to tell you very much. The reason will only work after the fact. Once you establish that it is wrong, you can use your reason further to kind of build on that. But the foundation itself is based on your passions, on your feelings. So that is one of the interesting criticisms he put. Why is he even putting it? Because remember, those people, when science first kicked in around 16th century, Enlightenment itself put so much faith in reason. People thought reason, our rational approach, is the most important thing. This is how we can figure everything out. And Hume kind of cools us down a bit and says, wait a minute, you are jumping ahead of yourselves here. Our reason is not the first thing there. The first thing there is how we feel as human beings. And only based on that, we take our reason and kind of start to go on further from that. But we have to remember that at the foundation of that, there's nothing but the feeling. And essentially you can also say in that sense we're all animals. This is kind of like the animal approach. Any animal knows that it's not fun to be murdered. Any animal will pursue what is good for its well-being and avoid what is wrong for that animal. And in that sense we are no different than animals. Yes, we have reason, which we can apply in addition to that to figure out better ways to avoid these dangers, to create laws, to create police, and so on. Animals can't do that. But that's already on top of these feelings. That's not something at the core of everything. So this is kind of deflationary theory of reason, which will become more popular, more and more popular, and you'll see when we get to existentialism after the spring break that that basically is at the foundation of this movement, this idea that reason is overvalued, that the most important part in our life is not reason, it actually is feeling. It's how you feel about stuff. So again, you're saying reason is just a slave of our passions. This is a quote. Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. Okay, and finally the question of existence of God. So why did they call him an atheist? Well, he did address it in his dialogues concerning natural religion. He went over all these arguments for the existence of God. Remember those arguments we heard so many times from Augustine, and then St. Anselm, and then Thomas Aquinas, and then Descartes. So he actually criticizes all of them, and he says that none of them really works. He says you can't prove the existence of God using your reason. So not only your reason is not very good when it comes to morality, it's not very good when it comes to the existence of God either. You simply cannot apply it. Now, this is some of the criticisms he has. Remember that argument that God exists by definition, the ontological argument. So, if you understand the definition of God as the greatest thing, and the greatest thing, of course, would be greater if it exists, and if it doesn't exist, then you understand that God exists. That's how this argument was going. It's from St. Anselm. Descartes thought it was a good argument. Hume says, no, that really does not prove you anything. reason cannot establish the matter of fact. And existence, remember, there's two things, the relation of ideas and matters of fact. So your reason cannot establish the matter of fact, and existence is the question of fact. Whether or not something exists can only be figured out how? Let's say I want to find out whether there exists a dog in an apartment next to mine. How can I figure it out? Experience, exactly. That's the only way. You cannot go from definition. Definition will only tell you how your ideas work. It will not tell you how the existence work. Existence and relation of ideas are two different things. So you cannot figure out a fact from idea. It's the other way around. The idea comes from fact, not the fact from idea. So you may have an idea of existing God, but whether this God actually exists is not a question of your idea. It's the question of reality, which is independent of your ideas. So he says that is not a good way to prove. Remember another argument we encountered, every effect must have a cause. That's actually Thomas Aquinas' argument. Cosmological argument. He's saying everything has a cause, right? So the cause of the world must be God. The criticism Hume puts here is this. So we have the world, right? And we are wondering what caused the world. So we say God. God caused the world. Okay, excellent. We gave an explanation to that. What's the next question? The next question obviously is, well, where did God come from? And what is the answer to that? Well, God was always there. And Hume says, wait a minute. So why do we need God to explain the existence of the world? Why can't we just say the world was always there? I mean, to say that God was always there makes just about as much sense as to say the world was always there. If everything has to have a cause, then he says, I'm sorry, God has to have a cause too. And if God is an exception, why can't the world be an exception? So he says it just doesn't work. It's not a good argument. He found a number of other difficulties with all these arguments. So one thing he's saying, they say you need a perfect God in order to create imperfect world. Remember, it was one of the other arguments Aquinas was using. And he's saying, why? Why do you need something perfect to create something imperfect? Why can't you just have something a little bit more perfect? It's like to say, imagine a scale, right? And you have something on one end of the scale and something on the other end of the scale. So let's say this is 1 pound. Do you need infinite weight here in order to that one to go up? No. You just need 1.1 pound here, and it will go up just as well. Similarly with the world. Why do you need something infinitely perfect to create the world? Why can't you just have somebody who is a little bit more perfect than the world itself? That works. Then the world itself is not perfect. He's saying, why then should the creator of the world be perfect? It seems like the world doesn't show that much of a perfection in it. In fact, it is in fact amazing, but is it perfect? Clearly not. So maybe the creator of the world actually did a rather bad job. Maybe he even tried many times. He's saying he may have had many failed attempts. Isn't it what we normally observe when somebody makes something, that he makes it and it's not very good, and then he makes a little bit better one, and then the better? Maybe that's what happened. You're saying maybe our world is like a version 5776, and there were all these other versions before, and he discarded them because they were no good. What evidence do we have that there's only one God? I mean, isn't it better to have a team? So maybe there's a group of gods. Why do we think there's only one? And finally, if we are using this anthropomorphic analogy, if we're thinking of God as some sort of human being, shouldn't the architect also be physical, just like the world, right? Doesn't it make then sense to imagine God indeed like some sort of human-like, maybe just slightly more powerful creature? So in other words, even if we do imagine some sort of source of the world, that source doesn't have to be anything like the God of the Bible. And he had like a little bit of a preview of a Darwin there, because he was saying, and remember, according to the Bible, the world was made in the 7 days, already the way it is today. But Darwin was later able to prove that there was actually evolution. However, that happened in the 19th century. We're talking 100 years prior to that, but Hume was already saying, well, it kind of makes sense when if you look at the world to think of it as some sort of something in the process of development, like an animal or a vegetable, something which kind of is growing, kind of becoming better, changing, rather than a fixed thing. So he actually thought that made more sense than the idea that the world was made the way it is today in one piece. And again, as we know, Darwin was actually later able to prove it with all these fossils and stuff. Now, so what's his attitude towards religion then? Can we say he's an atheist as he was blamed? No, he was not an atheist. Again, being consistent, he's saying, just like we have no proof that God exists, we also do not have any proof that God doesn't exist. And in fact, using our feeble mind, it would be very courageous of us to make such an assumption. So that is what we call agnostic. Agnostic is a person who says, I'm unable to say one way or the other to make this conclusion whether God exists or not. I don't believe there's any evidence that God exists, and I don't believe there's any evidence that God does not exist. So either one is a possibility. Of course, back in the 18th century, that was already considered very revolutionary, and that's again why he never got this chair at the University of Edinburgh. They thought that morally he was not fit for educating students. That was considered very dangerous ideas at the time, and somebody who publishes work with this kind of philosophy was not considered fit for office of a professor. Anyway, so agnosticism again is this kind of approach, and we remember we already mentioned that these religious views were evolving and going from like full belief of the medieval ages, and then remember next was Deism, which is an idea there is God, but he does not interfere in daily affairs. He just created the world like a clock, and the world is now rolling. And agnosticism is the next step. It's basically say, well, we don't even know if there is such God. It's possible, but maybe not. Okay, so what's the conclusion? Note that he questions everything. It's why the book also calls him a skeptic. Skeptical view. Can you live like that? And Hume, of course, would tell you absolutely. That's the only way to live. Even though you don't know any of these things for sure, there's nothing preventing you from enjoying your life. Do you really need to know whether there are objects and whether they follow laws? Not really. I mean, as long as every time I have this idea of a tasty meal, I feel pleased by the result, I'm good. I mean, do you really need this kind of philosophical approach? That from the point of view of philosophy, from again this kind of strictly logical, rational view, it seems to him that it is very natural for us to reach the conclusion that we don't know whether the world exists. We have no reason to believe that there are either actual objects or even that we ourselves is an actual something other than this chain of perceptions. We do know there's perceptions going on, just like Descartes said, but Descartes was going a little too far when he said I exist, because when you say I, that I already has more of a meaning than just stream of perceptions. It says there's something behind this stream. something substantial, that type of spiritual substance. And Hume is saying, no, you cannot conclude that either. That's, again, going too far. We have no evidence for that. There's nothing to prove it to us. Okay, so naturally life goes on, and we have to approach it somehow. Mitigated skepticism, that's kind of an approach he is suggesting. Basically just going with the flow. Doing things as if the world existed, because that works perfectly well. Now, notice that it's always like this in philosophy in a way. It's kind of like a pendulum. When it swings one way, it then swings the other way. So we started with, again, this hard materialism of Hobbes, and slowly went all the way to some sort of first not believing that even material objects exist, but at least spiritual exists, and now we are skeptical that anything exists. So what's next? Of course, next, when we get to Kant, we will kind of swing back. Kant will try to put it all together. That's his genius. He is essentially trying to take into account the ideas of Descartes, the ideas of Locke, the ideas of Berkeley, and the ideas of Hume, who also influenced him greatly. Kant himself was saying that he was a dogmatist for quite a long time before he read Hume. Hume, according to Kant, woke him up from dogmatic slumber. What does it mean? Well, dogmatism is basically taking things for granted, saying, well, the world as we see it around us, for example, definitely does exist. That would be a dogmatic approach. So what Hume did is question that and said, does it? Does it really exist? Do we have evidence for that? Now, Kant was trying to give an answer to Hume. He was trying to explain why we actually have good reason to believe the world exists, and how we justify that, and what does that actually mean. So Kant's ideas are extremely influential. We distinguish philosophy on pre-Kantian and post-Kantian. And post-Kantian philosophy is nothing like pre-Kantian, which is also why it's like a culmination of this part of the class. In order for us to get anywhere after Kant, talk about Marx, talk about existentialism or whatever else, we have to understand Kant. So I hope you guys will read this next chapter. We'll talk about Kant on Wednesday. Very interesting, very important. There's actually a couple of other videos I have from last year on Kant on my YouTube. I'll send you links later. But next time we'll try to, in this one lecture, give a good overview of Kant's ideas. They are amazing. They truly are amazing. They give a very, very influential and interesting point of view about reality, about what is reality like. They actually find a place for God there too. They kind of explain to you, if there's God, how can we understand God, and in the same time the reality itself, how the reality works, and so on. Okay, well, yes, thank you too. I guess that's all we have for today. On Wednesday, like I said, we'll talk about Kant, and then it will be all the material you need for the exam. I hope you will enjoy your evening, and I'll see you on Wednesday.